Lieutenant Commander Zethkar sat in the briefing room aboard the Hegemony command station, his webbed hands folded neatly on the metal table. The room smelled of recycled air and the nervous sweat of a dozen different alien species. Through the large window, he could see the stars of the Outer Rim territories, where the war with humanity had been raging for 3 years. Zethkar was proud of his reputation. As a member of the aquatic Morden species, he possessed the natural ability to remain calm under pressure. His large, dark eyes could process visual information faster than most species, and his analytical mind had earned him respect in the intelligence division. He had studied 17 different alien cultures and helped plan successful campaigns against 12 rebellious worlds. Today's assignment should be just another routine mission. Admiral Korthok, a massive reptilian officer with scarred hide, stood at the front of the room. His voice boomed through the translation speakers as he addressed the gathered intelligence officers. "The human problem continues to grow," Admiral Korthok began, his claws clicking against the display screen. "For 3 years, we have fought these primitive mammals, and still they resist. High Command wants detailed intelligence on their capabilities. And weaknesses?" Zethkar listened with professional interest. The humans had been discovered by Hegemony scouts only 5 years ago, a young species that had barely reached beyond their own solar system. Most newly discovered civilizations either joined the Hegemony willingly or were absorbed after brief resistance. The humans were different. They fought back. Lieutenant Commander Zethkar, the Admiral's voice cut through his thoughts, "will embed with the 23rd Reconnaissance Fleet. Your mission is to observe human defensive positions in the Kepler 442 system and provide tactical analysis." Zethkar nodded, his gill slits fluttering slightly with anticipation. "What intelligence do we have on their current capabilities, sir?" Admiral Korthok activated the holographic display. Images of human ships and weapons appeared in the air. Between them, the vessels looked crude compared to Hegemony technology, with thick armor plating and simple weapon systems. "Humans rely on brute force rather than sophisticated tactics," the Admiral explained. "Their ships are heavily armored but slow. Their weapons are powerful but inaccurate. They compensate for technological inferiority with aggressive behavior." Officer Colonel Vexani, from the insectoid click species, raised a sharp-clawed appendage. "What about their ground forces?" "Primitive but stubborn," Admiral Korthak replied. "They use kinetic weapons and explosive devices. No energy shields. No plasma technology. They fight like animals when cornered, but they lack strategic thinking." Zethkar made notes on his datapad. The assessment seemed straightforward. Humans were a young species with limited technology, fighting a hopeless war against superior forces. His job would be to document their defensive strategies and identify weaknesses for future campaigns. "Are there any special considerations for this mission?" Zethkar asked. The Admiral paused for a moment, and Zethkar noticed something strange. Several officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. A few veterans who had returned from the human front seemed too tense at the question. "Exercise standard caution," Admiral Korthok said finally. "Humans can be unpredictable in combat situations." After the briefing, Zethkar returned to his quarters to prepare for the mission. He had 3 days before departure aboard the Stealth. Ship voids, Edge. The time would be spent studying human language, culture, and military procedures. The language came easily to Zethkar's trained mind. Human speech patterns were simple compared to the complex harmonics of his native Morden tongue. Their written language used basic symbols, and their tactical terminology was direct and unimaginative. Human culture proved more interesting. Unlike most species the Hegemony had encountered, humans seemed to value individual achievement over collective harmony. Their history was filled with conflicts between different groups, which explained their aggressive nature. They had spent centuries fighting each other before discovering space travel. What puzzled Zethkar was their approach to warfare. Most species developed increasingly sophisticated methods of combat as they advanced technologically. Humans seemed to prefer direct confrontation. Their military doctrine emphasized speed, overwhelming firepower, and something they called shock and awe. On his second day of preparation, Zethkar, visited the station's medical bay to receive immunizations against human pathogens. Dr. Veltar, the chief medical officer, was a fellow Morden who had served in the Intelligence Division for 20 years. Going to the human front? Dr. Veltar asked, as he administered the injections. Reconnaissance mission in the Kepler 442 system, Zethkar confirmed. Dr. Veltar was quiet for a moment, his large eyes focused on the medical instruments. I've treated officers returning from human engagements, he said finally. Physical. Wounds heal quickly. Other injuries take longer. Psychological trauma. More requests for psychiatric evaluation than from any other front. Dr. Veltar finished the injections and sealed the medical kit. Humans fight differently than other species. Zethkar wanted to ask more questions, but Dr. Veltar had already moved on to his next patient. The conversation left him curious, but not concerned. Every war produced psychological casualties. It was natural for soldiers to be affected by combat. On his final day before departure, Zethkar reviewed combat footage from previous engagements with human forces. The video showed exactly what he expected. Human ships charging directly into superior hegemony formations. Human ground troops attacking fortified positions with inadequate equipment. Human pilots flying damaged fighters. Long after their craft should have been abandoned, the footage confirmed the intelligence briefings. Humans fought with reckless abandon, throwing themselves at enemy positions without regard for tactical superiority or strategic advantage. It was wasteful and inefficient, but occasionally effective through sheer determination. Zethkar made careful notes about human weapon capabilities and ship designs. But he found himself distracted by something else in the footage. The humans never seemed to retreat in good order. When their positions became untenable, they either fought to the last soldier or destroyed their own equipment to prevent capture. It was tactically sound but emotionally puzzling. Most species knew when they were beaten. They would surrender, regroup, or withdraw to fight another day. Humans seemed to treat every engagement as if retreat was not an option. It was an interesting cultural quirk that might prove useful in predicting their behavior. The morning of departure, Zethkar packed his equipment and reported to the docking bay. The Void's Edge was a sleek reconnaissance vessel equipped with the latest stealth technology and long-range sensors. Captain Morkith, a veteran hegemony officer, greeted him at the airlock. First time in human space? Captain Morkith asked as they walked through the ship's corridors. Yes, sir. I'm looking forward to observing their tactics firsthand. Captain Morkith gave him a strange look, observing from a safe distance, I hope. Humans have a tendency to make things complicated. The ship departed the station and jumped to hyperspace, beginning the 3-day journey to the edge of human territory. Zethkar spent the time reviewing his mission parameters and studying detailed maps of the Kepler 442 system. According to intelligence reports, the system contained a small human mining operation that served as cover for a military outpost. The plan was simple. Approach under stealth, observe the installation from long range, catalog defensive capabilities, and return with detailed analysis. Zethkar felt confident about the mission. His analytical skills and Morden patience made him ideal for reconnaissance work. The humans might be unpredictable in direct combat, but observation missions relied on staying hidden and avoiding contact entirely. On the final night before reaching human space, Zethkar made his last personal, logged entry before the mission began. He wrote about his expectations for the assignment, his confidence in hegemony technology, and his professional assessment of human capabilities. The entry concluded with a line that would haunt him in the weeks to come. Humans appear to compensate for technological inferiority with reckless abandon. This aggressive approach may be tactically effective in some situations, but it demonstrates a fundamental lack of strategic thinking. I expect to gather valuable intelligence on their defensive capabilities without significant complications. As the Void's Edge dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of human territory, Zethkar prepared his equipment and reviewed his orders one final time. He had no way of knowing that within hours, everything he believed about warfare, tactics, and the nature of intelligent species would be forever changed. The asteroid belt around Kepler-446 stretched endlessly through space. Chunks of rock and ice tumbling in slow orbit around the distant star. Zethkar stood in the observation deck of the Void's Edge, watching the scanner displays as they approached. The suspected human outpost. "Stealth systems operating at maximum efficiency," reported Lieutenant Jackdaw from his station. "We should be invisible to their primitive sensors." Captain Morkith nodded from the command chair. "Take us closer to Asteroid Cluster 7, L4. Intelligence suggests the humans have mining operations there." Zethkar adjusted his recording equipment and prepared to begin his observations. According to the mission briefing, a small human mining vessel called the CDF Ranger operated in this sector, providing cover for military installations. The plan was simple: observe from a safe distance, record their activities, and analyze their defensive capabilities. The Void's Edge moved silently through the asteroid field, its advanced stealth technology making it nearly impossible to detect. Zethkar felt confident in their approach. Hegemony stealth systems had never failed against primitive species. "Contact bearing 27 Mark IV, the sensor operator announced suddenly. "Human vessel, frigate class, approximately 800 meters. Through the viewing screen, Zethkar saw the human ship for the first time. The CDF Ranger looked exactly like the intelligence reports described: thick armor plating, simple weapon mounts, and crude thruster systems. It moved slowly through the asteroid field, conducting what appeared to be routine patrol operations. "Perfect," Captain Morkith said quietly. "We can observe their patrol patterns without being detected." Zethkar began recording, noting the ship's movement patterns and weapon configurations. The human vessels seemed unaware of their presence. Following a predictable route between the larger asteroids, everything was proceeding according to plan. Then the human ship turned directly toward them. "Captain," the sensor operator called out, his voice tight with confusion. "The human vessel has changed course. They're heading straight for us." Captain Morkith leaned forward in his chair. "Impossible. Our stealth systems are active. They cannot detect us." But the human ship continued its approach, accelerating now with purpose rather than patrol speed. Zethkar watched through his recording equipment as the vessel's weapon systems came online. "They've locked weapons on our position, Lieutenant." Jackdaw reported, disbelief clear in his voice. "Evasive maneuvers," Captain Morkith ordered. "How are they tracking us?" The Void's Edge began to turn, but the human ship was already firing. Bright flashes of kinetic weapons lit up the space between them as projectiles streaked toward their position. "Shields holding," reported the defensive systems officer. "Captain, these are just metal slugs." "How did they penetrate our stealth?" "Field." Zethkar stared at the human ship in fascination and growing alarm. The vessel was badly outgunned, facing a superior hegemony warship with advanced shields and weapons. Any rational commander would have called for reinforcements or attempted to escape. Instead, the humans were attacking. The human ship took heavy damage from the Void's Edge's return fire. Zethkar could see atmosphere venting from several hull breaches, and their engine output was dropping rapidly. Still, they continued firing. "Their main weapon array is destroyed," Lieutenant Jackdaw announced. "They should withdraw now." Human ship did not withdraw. Instead, it changed course again, heading directly toward the Void's Edge at maximum speed. "Captain," the sensor operator said, his voice rising in pitch. "They're on a collision course. They're trying to ram us." Captain Morkith stared at the display in shock. No species attempts ramming attacks against superior vessels. It's suicide. But the human ship kept coming. Through the communication array, they could hear transmissions from the CDF Ranger. The universal translator rendered the words in flat, mechanical tones, but the meaning was clear. "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the Colonial Defense Force. You want to hunt in human space? Then you'll get a fight." The collision threw both ships spinning through the asteroid field. Emergency lighting bathed the Void's Edge in red as damage reports flooded the bridge. The human ship had struck them in midships, tearing through the outer hull and causing massive structural damage. "Boarding pods launched from the human vessel," the security chief reported. "They're attempting to board us." Gar could hardly believe what he was hearing. Human ship was crippled, venting atmosphere and debris. Yet instead of abandoning their vessel or requesting assistance, they were launching an assault on a larger, better-armed opponent. "Security teams to boarding areas," Captain Morketh ordered. "Repel boarders." Through the ship's internal sensors, Zethkar watched the human boarding party cut through the outer airlock. The leader was a human female with short brown hair and the insignia of a chief engineer. She was using a handheld cutting torch to burn through reinforced metal, while her companions provided covering fire. "Lisa Park, chief engineer," she announced through the communication system. "We're coming aboard whether you like it or not." The humans fought through corridors filled with atmosphere that would poison most species. They wore basic protective suits and carried simple projectile weapons. But they advanced with determination that seemed to ignore tactical reality. Zethkar followed their progress through the ship's security monitors. When their equipment failed, they improvised. Their numbers were reduced. They continued fighting. A human marine named Tony Rivera led the assault team through 3 decks of defended corridors, losing half his people, but never slowing down. The most disturbing moment came when the humans discovered they were hopelessly outnumbered. Instead of surrendering or attempting to negotiate, Captain Morrison's voice came through the communication system again. "All hands, this is the captain. If we can't take this ship, we'll make sure nobody gets it. Activating self-destruct in 60 seconds. Felt something cold settle in his stomach. The humans were prepared to destroy both vessels rather than accept defeat. It was beyond irrational. It was incomprehensible. "They're going to kill everyone," Lieutenant Jector whispered, themselves included. Captain Morketh seemed frozen by the impossibility of the situation. No species the hegemony had ever encountered chose mutual destruction over surrender. It violated every principle of survival and military logic. Zethkar found himself moving toward the communication station. His analytical mind was racing, trying to process what he was witnessing. These humans were not fighting to win. They were fighting to ensure that attacking them came at an unacceptable cost. "Open a channel," he ordered the communications officer. "This is Lieutenant Commander Zethkar of the Hegemony Intelligence Division." He broadcast to the human ship. "You propose an immediate ceasefire?" The countdown stopped at 15 seconds. "Why should we trust alien invaders?" Captain Morrison's voice came back. Zethkar chose his words carefully. "Because we are both military professionals. Neither of us wants unnecessary death." There was a long pause. Then the human captain's voice returned, calmer, but still edged with suspicion. "What do you propose?" "Mutual withdrawal. Your people return to your ship. We repair our vessels, and both sides depart." Another pause. Zethkar could hear voices arguing in the background of the human transmission. Finally, Captain Morrison responded, "Agreed. But understand this, alien. You came hunting in human space. Now you know what that costs." The boarding party withdrew with military efficiency, carrying their wounded and leaving no equipment behind. As they departed, Zethkar caught sight of the human chief engineer, Lisa Park. Her protective suit was torn, and she had burns on her hands from holding damaged power conduits. But she was still functioning. The human ship limped away into the asteroid field, trailing debris and atmosphere. It should have been destroyed by the damage it had sustained, but somehow it continued operating. Through long-range sensors, Zethkar watched as the crew performed emergency repairs using materials that should not have been sufficient for the task. "Captain," Morketh ordered the Void's Edge to withdraw to a safe distance for repairs. The encounter had lasted less than 2 hours, but the ship would need days to fix the damage caused by the ramming attack. "I don't understand," Lieutenant Jector said as they watched the human ship disappear among the asteroids. "They were outnumbered and outgunned. Why did they attack?" Zethkar stared at the empty space where the CDF Ranger had been. His mind was struggling to process what he had witnessed. Everything in his training told him that the human response had been irrational, wasteful, and tactically unsound. Yet, they had achieved their objective. The hegemony ship was damaged and forced to withdraw from human territory. "They weren't trying to win," he said slowly, speaking more to himself than to the other officers. "They were teaching us a lesson." "Lesson?" Captain Morkith asked. Zethkar continued staring at the stars, his analytical mind working through the implications. That attacking humans is more expensive than leaving them alone. The bridge fell silent as the other officers considered his words. In the distance, Kepler 442 burned with cold light, different to the small drama that had just played out in its asteroid belt. 3 weeks after the encounter with the CDF Ranger, Zethkar found himself crouched in a camouflaged observation post on the rocky surface of Kepler 4 for 2C's third moon. The failed reconnaissance mission had resulted in new orders from High Command. They wanted detailed intelligence on human defensive tactics, and Zethkar was now embedded with the 47th Hegemony Strike Force. The target was Firebase Echo, human stronghold built into the side of a mountain crater. Through his enhanced optical equipment, Zethkar could see the installation clearly. Energy shields flickered around the perimeter, automated defense turrets tracked across empty sky, and the entrance to underground bunkers were protected by thick metal doors. 200 human defenders, reported Colonel Vexford, the Strike Force commander, our forces number 1200, with air support and heavy artillery. This should be finished in 2 days. Zethkar made notes on his datapad while studying the human base. The defensive position looked standard for a military outpost. The humans had built their installation using basic engineering principles, nothing that suggested advanced tactical thinking. "What are our intelligence estimates on their supply situation?" asked Major Krelton, the operations officer. "Limited food and ammunition," Colonel Dexfer replied. "They've been cut off from reinforcement for 6 days. Once we begin the assault, they should surrender quickly." The bombardment began at dawn. Hegemony artillery units fired high-energy plasma charges at the human defensive positions. While fighter aircraft struck at the outer perimeter, the mountain shook with each impact, and clouds of dust and debris filled the air. Zethkar watched through his recording equipment as the human defenders responded to the attack. Instead of taking cover and conserving their resources, they immediately began returning fire. Human artillery pieces, primitive kinetic weapons that fired explosive shells, answered the hegemony bombardment with surprising accuracy. "They're wasting ammunition," observed Major Krelton. "This rate of fire cannot be sustained." But the humans continued their counterattack. Zethkar could see figures moving along the defensive walls, human soldiers operating weapons manually, while their automated systems came under fire. When one gun position was destroyed, teams of defenders rushed to repair it or set up replacement weapons. The siege settled into a pattern that puzzled Zethkar. The hegemony forces had overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower, but the humans refused to behave like a force under siege. Instead of waiting for the enemy to make mistakes, they launched constant probing attacks against hegemony positions. On the third night, Zethkar observed a human raid that made no tactical sense. A team of 20 soldiers, led by a sergeant named Pete Collins, infiltrated hegemony supply lines and destroyed a single ammunition truck. The raid cost them 8 soldiers killed and 6 wounded, while causing minimal damage to the overall hegemony war effort. "Wasteful," Colonel Vexfer commented when he received the damage report. "They're throwing away their people for meaningless objectives, debt." But Zethkar noticed something that the colonel had missed. The human raid had forced the hegemony to assign extra guards to their supply convoys. Resources that should have been used for the assault were now tied up in defensive positions. The humans had traded 20 soldiers to reduce their enemy's offensive capability. As the siege continued, Zethkar began to see similar patterns everywhere. Human defenders would abandon strong positions to attack weak ones, forcing the hegemony to spread their forces thinner. When hegemony troops advanced, the humans would counterattack immediately, regardless of whether they had sufficient numbers to succeed. The breakthrough came during the second week, when hegemony engineers finally breached the outer defensive wall. Colonel Vexfer ordered a full assault, expecting the humans to retreat to their inner bunkers and begin negotiating surrender terms. Instead, the human defenders fought harder. Zethkar watched in amazement as Colonel Beth Anderson, the human commander, coordinated a defense that defied military logic. Rather than falling back to prepared positions, her troops advanced to meet the hegemony assault in the breach itself. Human soldiers armed with primitive kinetic weapons engaged armored hegemony troops in hand-to-hand combat. They're fighting in the worst possible position, Major Krelton observed. The breach offers no cover and no tactical advantage, yet the humans held the breach for 6 hours. Zethkar recorded the entire engagement, watching as individual human soldiers performed acts that seemed impossible. A private named Danny Coomer held a choke point alone for 2 hours after his squad was eliminated. Using broken equipment and improvised weapons to keep hegemony forces from advancing, when Coomer's ammunition ran out, he continued fighting with tools and debris. When those were gone, he fought with his bare hands against opponents twice his size and wearing full combat armor. He was finally overwhelmed by sheer numbers. But by then, human reinforcements had arrived to retake the position. The medical officer, a human female named Nancy Wright, performed surgery on wounded soldiers in a bunker while artillery shells exploded overhead. When the bunker's power failed, she continued operating by flashlight. When the flashlight batteries died, she used a handheld flare. When her medical supplies ran low, she improvised with maintenance equipment and spare parts. Most disturbing to Zethkar was the realization that the humans were not fighting desperately. No, they were fighting systematically, as if this level of sacrifice was normal and expected. Each defender seemed to understand exactly what was required and was prepared. To pay that price, the siege entered its 3rd week with hegemony forces holding the outer perimeter, but unable to advance further. The humans had retreated to their underground bunkers, but instead of beginning surrender negotiations, they intensified their resistance. Master Sergeant Roy Phillips coordinated artillery strikes from a position that should have been overrun. Days earlier, he was calling down fire on hegemony positions while simultaneously directing the evacuation of wounded through tunnels that Zethkar hadn't known existed. "How many tunnel systems do they have?" Colonel Vexver demanded during a strategy meeting. "Intelligence estimates were incomplete," admitted Major Krelton. "They appear to have been digging since they arrived." Zethkar studied the underground. Sensor readings. The humans had excavated a network of passages that extended far beyond the official boundaries of Firebase Echo. They had been preparing for a siege that could last months, not days. The end came suddenly, but not in the way anyone expected. On the 21st day of the siege, Colonel Anderson's voice came through the communication system. "Attention hegemony forces. Firebase Echo is no longer strategically valuable to human operations. We are executing tactical withdrawal. Recommend you clear the area in the next 10 minutes. Zethkar felt a chill of recognition. He had heard similar words before, during the encounter with the CDF Ranger. "They're going to destroy the installation," he reported to Colonel Dexfer. "Impossible. They're underground. Can't escape. Fast enough to avoid their own explosives." But the humans were already moving. Through his sensors, Zethkar watched as teams of defenders evacuated through the tunnel network. Carrying their wounded and destroying equipment as they withdrew, they moved with practiced efficiency, as if they had rehearsed this evacuation dozens of times. The explosions began exactly 10 minutes after Colonel Anderson's warning. Not just the bunkers, but the entire mountain crater erupted in a series of detonations that collapsed the defensive position completely. Hegemony forces barely had time to retreat to minimum safe distance. When the dust cleared, Firebase Echo no longer existed. The mountain had been hollowed out and collapsed, creating an impassable crater where the human stronghold had stood. Any hegemony forces in the area would have been buried under millions of tons of rock. "They destroyed their own base," Major Krelton said in disbelief, after defending it for 3 weeks. But Zethkar was studying the tactical displays and beginning to understand. The humans had never intended to hold Firebase Echo permanently. They had used the siege to tie down 1,200 hegemony troops for 3 weeks, preventing them from attacking other human positions. When the base was no longer useful, they had simply abandoned it. The cost had been enormous. The hegemony had lost over 300 soldiers and massive amounts of equipment. The siege had consumed resources that could have supplied a dozen smaller operations. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that attacking human positions was expensive and time-consuming. Even when successful, "Sir," reported the communications officer, "we're receiving orders to pursue the retreating human forces." Colonel Vexfer stared at the ruined crater where Firebase Echo had been. "Negative. We're returning to base for resupply and reinforcement." As the 47th Strike Force prepared to withdraw, Zethkar continued studying the collapsed mountain. Somewhere in the tunnel, network below, Colonel Beth Anderson and her surviving defenders were making their way to new positions. They had lost Firebase Echo, but they had achieved something more valuable. They had taught the hegemony that victory against humans was possible, but it came at a price that few commanders would be willing to pay. The humans didn't fight to win individual battles. 2 months after the siege of Firebase Echo, Zethkar sat in a sterile analysis chamber aboard the hegemony dreadnought Eternal Dominance. His new assignment was intelligence analysis, reviewing data from dozens of engagements across the human front. High Command wanted a comprehensive report on human combat effectiveness, and Zethkar was considered the expert after his field experiences. The numbers spread across his workstation told a story that made no sense by conventional military standards. Battle after battle, engagement after engagement, the humans lost more often than they won. Their casualty rates were 3 times higher than hegemony forces. Their equipment was consistently inferior. Their tactical positions were usually disadvantageous. Yet, somehow the hegemony was losing the war. Zethkar pulled up the files on the Battle of Titan Station, studying the tactical reports with growing confusion. Commander Helen Brooks had defended a fuel depot against impossible odds for 6 days. The station had been surrounded by an entire hegemony fleet. With no possibility of reinforcement or escape, the humans had lost the station. Brooks and her entire garrison were killed in the final assault. The hegemony gained control of a strategic refueling point. By every measure of military success, it should have been counted as a victory, but the cost had been devastating. The 6-day siege had allowed 50,000 human civilians to evacuate from nearby colonies. The hegemony fleet had lost 4 capital ships to suicide attacks and booby traps. The fuel depot itself had been so thoroughly sabotaged that it took 8 months to make it operational again. Humans lost Titan Station but saved the civilian population. Zethkar muttered to himself, making notes on his datapad. They traded a military asset for strategic advantage. He moved to the next file, the defense of New Johannesburg. General Frank Turner had ordered his garrison to fight to the last soldier while civilians escaped through underground tunnels. The city had fallen after a month of urban warfare. The delay had allowed human reinforcements to establish defensive positions that held for 6 more months. Pattern. After pattern emerged from the data, the humans never fought just to win. Individual battles. Every engagement served a larger strategic purpose that often seemed more important than immediate tactical success. They would sacrifice valuable positions to inflict maximum casualties on their enemies. They would defend worthless targets to buy time for more important operations. Most disturbing was what the humans did with their defeats. Other species became demoralized by losses, but humans seemed to use their failures as propaganda tools. Video recordings from human territory showed civilian populations becoming more determined after each military defeat, not less. Compute. Display casualty analysis for hegemony forces over the past year, Zethkar commanded. The holographic display showed statistics that should have been impossible. Despite winning more battles, hegemony forces were requesting transfers away from the human front at unprecedented rates. Medical reports showed increasing cases of combat stress, psychological breakdown, and what human doctors called battle fatigue. Zethkar had interviewed dozens of hegemony veterans during his analysis, and their accounts were remarkably consistent. Fighting humans was different from fighting any other species. It wasn't just the physical combat, but the psychological pressure of facing an enemy that never seemed to give up. Colonel Vextar, a seasoned hegemony officer, had been particularly disturbing to interview. The veteran had fought on 17 Different fronts during his career, but 2 years against humans had left him requesting reassignment to re-echelon duties. They don't fight like soldiers, Vextar had said during their classified interview. They fight like their entire species depends on every single engagement. Can't break their morale because they're not fighting for morale. They're fighting for something deeper. What do you mean? Zethkar had asked. Watch a human soldier who knows he's going to die, doesn't panic or try to escape. He calculates how much damage he can inflict before he falls. Every human death costs us more than it costs them. Zethkar had dismissed the colonel's assessment as combat stress. But now, looking at the data, he was beginning to understand. The humans had weaponized their own willingness to die. He pulled up intercepted human communications, using the translation software to decode their strategic discussions. What he found changed everything he thought he understood about the war. The humans were operating under something called the Terran doctrine. Zethkar spent hours studying the intercepted documents, trying to understand the strategic philosophy that guided human military operations. The doctrine was unlike anything. In hegemony military theory, instead of focusing on territorial gains or resource acquisition, it emphasized demonstrating the cost of threatening human survival. Every battle was designed to teach potential enemies that attacking humanity would be more expensive than leaving them alone. Computer, search human. Communications for references to species survival, Zethkar ordered. The results were overwhelming. Human military communications consistently framed individual battles as part of humanity's species-wide survival strategy. A single skirmish over a minor asteroid was discussed as if it were the last battle of their civilization. Zethkar found himself reading transcripts of conversations between human commanders that revealed the true scope of their strategic thinking. They weren't just fighting the hegemony, they were fighting to establish humanity's reputation in galactic politics. If we let them take one system without bleeding for it, every species in the galaxy will think humans are easy prey. One human general had said in an intercepted communication, "We have to make it clear that attacking us is never profitable." Another intercepted message was even more revealing. "We can't win this war with superior technology or numbers. We have to win it by being too dangerous and too expensive to conquer. Every battle is a demonstration." The realization hit Zethkar like a physical blow. The humans weren't trying to defeat the hegemony militarily. They were trying to teach the entire galaxy that humans were a species too costly to threaten. Each engagement was part of a massive educational program designed to establish deterrence through demonstrated resolve. Zethkar began analyzing hegemony strategic planning documents, looking for evidence that High Command understood what they were facing. What he found was disturbing in its implications. Recent hegemony military orders showed a pattern of avoiding human-controlled systems whenever possible. Diplomatic channels that hadn't existed 6 months ago were quietly exploring ceasefire agreements. Resource allocation was being shifted away from the human front toward other expansion targets. The official explanation was that humans weren't worth the resources required to defeat them. But Zethkar could see the real reason in the casualty. Reports and psychological evaluations. The hegemony wasn't withdrawing because humans were worthless. They were withdrawing because humans had proven they were too dangerous to fight. Computer. Analyze communication patterns between hegemony high command and sector commanders over the past 6 months, he ordered. The analysis revealed what Zethkar had suspected. Orders to engage human forces had become increasingly rare. When such orders were issued, they came with extensive provisions for minimizing casualties and avoiding prolonged engagements. The hegemony military machine was unconsciously adapting to avoid the kind of costly victories that characterize fighting against humans. Zethkar compiled his findings into a comprehensive report, but he knew that High Command would likely classify it and bury it in military archives. The conclusions were too disturbing for conventional military thinking. The humans had discovered something that no other species in galactic history had attempted. They had turned their own weakness into a weapon. By demonstrating absolute refusal to accept defeat, they had made themselves too expensive to conquer. More troubling was the evidence that their approach was beginning to influence other species. Zethkar had detected similar tactical patterns in reports from the Vegan Confederacy front. where rebellion was spreading among species that had been conquered decades ago. The humans hadn't just defended themselves, they had provided a template for resistance that other species were beginning to copy. It's the idea that conquest could be resisted, that freedom was worth any price, was spreading through the galaxy like a virus. As Zethkar prepared his final report, he found himself thinking about the human defenders he had observed during his time on the front lines. Captain Jake Morrison, willing to destroy his own ship rather than surrender. Colonel Beth Anderson, abandoning a fortress she had defended for 3 weeks. Private Danny Coomer, fighting alone until overwhelming numbers brought him down. Each of them had understood something that the hegemony was only beginning to comprehend. War wasn't just about winning battles or controlling territory. It was about demonstrating resolve so absolute that future enemies would choose not to fight at all. The humans were teaching the galaxy a lesson that would reshape interstellar politics for generations. They had proven that some species were simply too dangerous to threaten, not because of their weapons or their numbers, but because of their willingness to pay any price for freedom. 6 months had passed since Zethkar submitted his intelligence report to Hegemony High Command. The document had been classified as eyes only and buried in military archives, just as he had predicted. Now he sat in a comfortable office on Hegemony Station Gamma 7, officially assigned to strategic analysis of irregular resistance movements. But really exiled from the war he had tried to explain. The war with humanity continued, but everything had changed. Through his security clearance, Zethkar could access classified reports that painted a picture of gradual hegemony withdrawal from human space. The official statements spoke of resource reallocation and strategic repositioning, but the truth was simpler and more disturbing. The hegemony was afraid, not afraid of human weapons or ships or technology. They were afraid of what humans represented. The idea that a species could choose extinction over surrender had spread through hegemony military ranks like a disease. Infecting every level of command with doubt and hesitation, Zethkar reviewed the latest casualty reports from the human front. Physical losses were manageable, but psychological casualties continued to rise. Officers who had fought humans for more than 6 months showed consistent patterns of combat stress and depression. Many requested transfer to other fronts, claiming that fighting humans was different in ways they couldn't explain. The door to his office chimed, and Admiral Korthok entered without waiting for permission. The massive reptilian officer looked older than Zethkar remembered. "Your report on human resistance tactics," Admiral Korthok said. "Without preamble, High Command has finally decided it might be useful." Zethkar gestured to a chair, but the Admiral remained standing. "What changed their minds?" "The vegan confederacy situation has deteriorated beyond acceptable parameters," Admiral Korthok replied. "Species that accepted hegemony rule for decades are suddenly developing backbone. Their resistance tactics look remarkably familiar." Zethkar felt a cold sensation in his stomach. He had predicted this in his report, but hoping to be wrong and being proven right were different experiences. They're copying human methods. More than copying, they're improving on them. Admiral Korthok activated a holographic display showing star charts of the vegan sector. Red symbols marked active resistance, cells across 24 worlds. The vegan rebels aren't just fighting to make conquest expensive. They're fighting to prove that liberation is possible. The display showed tactical analyses that made Zethkar's gill slits flutter with recognition. Vegan resistance cells were using human-style tactics, accepting heavy casualties to inflict psychological damage on occupation forces, treating every engagement as a demonstration of resolve rather than an attempt at military victory, and coordinating their actions to maximize the cost of maintaining control. "How extensive is the rebellion?" Zethkar asked. 17 worlds in open revolt, with resistance movements on 30 more, Admiral Korthok replied grimly. "But that's not the worst part. Other species are watching. The Centauri Union has begun questioning their tributary status. The Rigel Collective is demanding renegotiation of their trade agreements." Zethkar understood the implications immediately. The humans hadn't just defended themselves successfully. They had provided a template that other species could follow. The idea that resistance was possible, that freedom was worth any price, was spreading across the galaxy. "What does High Command want from me?" Zethkar asked. Admiral Korthok deactivated the display and fixed him with a direct stare. "They want you to find a way to stop it. Use your expertise in human psychology to develop countermeasures against this resistance model." "Sir, with respect, I don't think you understand what we're dealing with." Zethkar began carefully. "This isn't a military tactic that can be countered with better weapons or strategies. It's a philosophical position that transcends tactical considerations." "Explain." Zethkar activated his own workstation, displaying the data he had been analyzing for months. Every species the hegemony has encountered follows the same basic survival pattern. When faced with superior force, they calculate the cost of resistance versus the cost of surrender. When resistance becomes too expensive, they submit. "That's rational behavior," Admiral Korthok said. "It's how civilized species avoid unnecessary death. But humans don't follow that pattern," Zethkar continued. "They treat surrender as more expensive than death. It's not a rational calculation in traditional terms. It's a fundamental value system that prioritizes freedom over survival." Admiral Korthok was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. And now other species are adopting this value system. More than adopting it, they're discovering. It was always there, waiting to be awakened. Zethkar pulled up intelligence reports from the vegan front. "Look at these intercepted communications. The rebels aren't talking about victory in military terms. They're talking about proving that their species has dignity, that they're worth more than comfortable slavery." The reports made disturbing reading. Vegan resistance fighters were using phrases that echoed human military communications. "Freedom is worth any price. Some things are more important than survival, and they'll remember the cost of this forever." The humans didn't just teach the galaxy how to resist, Zethkar continued. They taught them why resistance matters. Every species that watches human forces fight to the death rather than surrender learns that freedom is possible if you're willing to pay for it. Admiral Korthok studied the data with growing concern. "What's your recommendation?" Zethkar had been dreading this question for months. The answer was clear from his analysis, but he knew it would be unacceptable to military leadership. Immediate diplomatic contact with human authorities, he said finally. Negotiate a ceasefire and formal recognition of human sovereignty. Make it clear that the hegemony respects their independence and has no further territorial ambitions in human space. "Absolutely not," Admiral Korthok replied immediately. "The hegemony doesn't negotiate with primitive species. It would set a precedent that would encourage rebellion throughout our territory. The humans have proven that species can successfully resist hegemony expansion. Other species are already following their example. Continuing the war only validates their message that the hegemony can be fought and beaten." Admiral Korthok began pacing, his claws clicking against the metal floor. "High Command will never accept withdrawal from human space. Many resources have been invested, too many lives lost." "Then you're asking me to solve an impossible problem," Zethkar replied. "You want me to find a way to defeat an idea with military force? But ideas can't be destroyed with weapons. They can only be replaced with better ideas." "What better idea do you suggest?" Zethkar had been thinking about this question for weeks, reviewing everything he had learned about human psychology and resistance tactics. The answer was simple in concept, but revolutionary in practice. "Voluntary association," he said. "Instead of conquest and occupation, offer genuine partnership. Species that choose to join the hegemony willingly, with guarantees of autonomy and cultural preservation, don't need to be controlled by force." Admiral Korthok stared at him in disbelief. "Yes, suggesting we abandon the foundation of hegemony expansion policy. I'm suggesting we adapt before the foundation collapses on its own," Zethkar replied. "The humans have changed the rules of galactic politics. Species that once accepted conquest as inevitable now see it as a choice. We can either evolve our approach or watch our empire fragment as every subject species demands the freedom to resist." The Admiral was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of Zethkar's analysis. Finally, he spoke again, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Prepare a detailed briefing for the High Council. Include your recommendations for diplomatic contact and your assessment of the rebellion's spreading potential. Classification level maximum? Yes, sir. Admiral Korthak moved toward the door, then paused. Off the record, Zethkar. Do you think the humans planned this? Did they deliberately set out to destabilize hegemony control across the galaxy? Zethkar considered the question carefully. He thought about Captain Jake Morrison choosing to destroy his ship rather than surrender, about Colonel Beth Anderson defending a position she planned to abandon, about Private Danny Kumar fighting alone until overwhelming numbers brought him down. No, sir, he said finally. I don't think they planned it. They were just being human. The problem is that being human, as they define it, is apparently contagious. After Admiral Korthak left, Zethkar sat alone in his office, staring out at the stars through the station's viewports. And across the galaxy, other species were learning that they, too, could choose dignity over comfort, freedom over security. Zethkar began composing his briefing for the High Council, knowing that his recommendations would likely be rejected. Hegemony was a military organization built on the principle of expansion through force,